Everyone knows the story about how Bitcoin appeared out of nowhere in 2009, created by the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto, but I can't help but ask, was it really that simple? When you look at the timing right after the global financial crisis in 2008, it makes you wonder, was Bitcoin's birth just coincidence, or was it part of something bigger? If there's one thing I've learned in the markets and in life, is that nothing of real importance happens by accident. So today I want to share my thoughts on why Bitcoin and blockchain technology itself may have been created, and what that means for the future. My name is Paul Sampson, welcome back to DataDash. So again, folks, if you don't know me quite yet, I've been studying and tracking the 20-year housing market cycle for a very long time here, close to a decade now. With this as the main schematic, again, all credit to Phil Anderson, the author of The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking, for pointing this out. This is a very simple, high-level chart, but overall, this is a 18 to 20-year cycle that basically relates to the housing market cycle, which really relates to the stock market as well, and now crypto. And the birth of Bitcoin was always an interest of me because, again, these are basically 7 to 10 year run-ups that are met with a black swan event that causes a 2 to 4 year cool down period, basically a mid-cycle slowdown. At the end of this time frame, it's always met with high inflation, high interest rates. Everybody expects a recession or the drop to continue due to uncertainty, to be met with, again, just another face-melting rally to the true highs or the true tops. All right, and I've stacked up several iterations here, which just are the top numbers are the years in sequence here. The second ones are after that, and basically these are the beginning years, these are the black swan events, and this is the essential highs here, right? So you have all these starting points. You have these 4 black swan events that are just of the 4 last iterations. I can take this back another couple decades here as well, but you had the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s, the Gulf War in the 80s, 9/11 in 2001, COVID in 2020, and all of which had led to the final blow off top, or at least just rally to the upside, right? So for me, I've been tracking that the overall market in general would see a relatively overall high come in, which would set off the next major market crash, major market correction across real estate, across the stock market, and of course crypto at the time too. And that time frame lines up with 2026 to 2029, again basing this off of 18 to 20 years, which is, I know, a really wide range, and that time frame is obviously here, 2026 to 2029. So I take it back to the idea of Bitcoin's birth, right? Bitcoin and blockchain specifically. It was born back in 2008, right as we basically topped the last cycle for the housing market, at least these 20-year cycles. We're coming into the end of the next 20-year window here, and this is something that we've seen just over and over again in history. And this 20-year, finishing point has really got my attention because it's also the 100-year cyclical anniversary of the Great Depression, and we'll come back to that here in a second. But overall, Bitcoin, born in 2008, for the longest time, it was a scam. No major hedge funds or institutions or even politicians or governments would touch it. Everybody was always calling it that a scam, and that it would go to zero. Don't mess with it, right? And those were all the time frames when it was literally the best time to get involved. Obviously, now looking back, time of recording, Bitcoin sits at about $115,000, $113,000, pretty consistently right here. And at the times where Bitcoin was $600 or less, or $3,000 in the 2018 low, or $3,000 in the 2020 low, or $15,000 in the 2022 low, the news, the media, the sources that be, all kind of pointed everyone away from these things at the best opportunities. And of course, when they get to the highs, that's when everybody starts to, praise them again. And the average person just misses out because of the emotional side of things, okay? And I've always asked myself how Bitcoin could be such a threat to certain things, right? If the government ever said, oh, it could be a threat to the dollar, it could be a threat to this or that, but yet we allowed it to be purchasable, by credit cards. We allowed it to be listed on our exchanges, on the CME exchange to begin with, and then now it's, got plenty of ETF backing behind it. And over time, obviously, the narrative has shifted there. And years ago, Bitcoin was pretty much, when I started in this market, it was 2017, and the idea was that you traded altcoins to get the more multiples, and then you would basically transfer that into Bitcoin. We couldn't even trade in dollars. We had to trade in Bitcoin at the time. And over the years, I feel like that kind of idea set has kind of withered away, and everybody really gravitated towards the altcoins for the more sizable ROIs, right? They didn't want to really be involved with Bitcoin because it was $20,000 or $30,000 or 60, and you couldn't see a 10x or a 50x, and the returns just seemed smaller at the time. So everybody would get into these altcoins that they think would be a little bit more higher returns. And secretly, the entire time, our governments, our institutions, our hedge funds were picking up the real asset at B, which is Bitcoin, and basically pricing everybody out along the way, right? While everyone else is holding altcoins for the most part as bag holders over time. And a perfect example of this is just the most notable one I came to mind was in 2017 with JP Morgan, who currently is a huge advocate of crypto and Bitcoin, or at least Bitcoin. And at the time it was, Bitcoin's a fraud that'll blow up, says JP Morgan. And this is just one example here. There's been several over the years, usually at the low side too, which is usually, so unfortunate for the news to come out and, kind of scare investors away when it's the best time to be involved. Another thing that I've always kind of noted is that it's also always had my attention that Bitcoin has managed to get in, at this point now it's very integrated, but along the way as the evolution has occurred, I watched it unfold pretty much daily. And I always noticed that the governments, the officials at hand, right, our leadership would always, talk negatively towards that asset, yet they were allowing it to be, added to our stock market, our exchanges, some of these things. And to me, it was always one of those things that it's only allowed to do what it's allowed to do, because if the governments did not want it at the time, right, they could have just easily said, no, we're not allowing, MasterCard, Visa to be able to make purchases through Coinbase. And at least for the Americans, that would have shut that down pretty much right away, right? For the most part, everybody could find new avenues, but well, we never really shut it down. I always think that it's one of those things that's always allowed. It's allowed to be what it's allowed to be, right? And then that takes me back to the creator again, right? So obviously Bitcoin, again, born in 2008, end of the financial crisis of 2008 to be, to note. And I've always had the inkling that it was basically just made by the governments. And I know that that's like totally goes against what everybody else thinks. I know the Satoshi Nakamoto character, has been pretty much anonymous for the entirety. Another person that I think is very much involved is Elon Musk. Even before he overly went, crazy with like Doge and representing Bitcoin and, talking about how Tesla buys this and that, just the amount of integration that he has and even has had, along the way, and making with, being involved with PayPal, which was essentially one of the first payment processors that you could transfer money between people, right? So I've always kind of had an idea that was something along the way. I think that in the total grand scheme is that governments created Bitcoin, and obviously that led to the blockchain technologies unfolding here. Elon probably had a piece of it too. Going back again to the timing right here, it's like one of those things where why did it come out here? We had our speculative, interest and in initial run up here. And then now we're coming up to this region right there, right? So what is the overall reason that I believe that Bitcoin and blockchain was introduced, especially at this time? I think it has everything to do with the 2029 cyclical anniversary of that Great Depression, on top of the 20-year area where we're likely to see some sort of detrimental drawdown in the markets. And that takes me over to this simple headline here, because this is what I've been really sitting on for the last several months here, is that everyone always asks me what would cause a Great Depression out of nowhere now, right? Or in the year or two, what would allow the markets to continue higher at this point, right? They seem like they're just never going to stop. Everyone's constantly anticipating a crash because it just seems like it should, as the market has been so overheated for so long. But again, going back to our time frame, we're still pretty much right on track as we're coming into this final end zone. I have real eyes set on about 2027, 2028, but 2026 has got just my initial cautious eyes at that point. When I'm looking at this headline here, again, what is the definition of a Great Depression? And that's what I do think we're on the heels of coming into the next few years here. And if we look at the previous Great Depression, it was a severe global and economic crisis that began in 1929, right, with the U.S. stock market crashing, which this is the S&P 500 during the Great Depression here, dropping almost 90%. All right, this is back in 1929, lasted about 3 years before we actually started to recover, and lasted 10 years before we got back to the highs, right? So that's what it's known as. It looks like it was a decade before it really recovered. But truly, if your timing was correct, you would have been scaling out along the way, and then you could have scaled back in. And obviously, we technically started to recover at this region, but that's not how the news would read it. But anyways, a severe global economic crisis that began in 1929, U.S. stock market crash, lasted about a decade. Again, that's not necessarily true, but leading to widespread unemployment and poverty and bank failures. And those three are what a Great Depression are built from: unemployment, which leads to poverty, and of course bank failures at that time as well, because when everybody loses their job and they have no money, what are they going to do? They're going to pull all their money, they're going to pull all their investments, everything of that nature. That's basically a bank run. Banks go under, all those things, right? Fundamentally changing the economic government policies worldwide. So these things right here, I think, are what Bitcoin was created for, which basically ushered in the overall blockchain. Everything, I think, is leading up to this, where artificial intelligence basically takes down 300 million jobs, right? So this number right here, if you're not familiar with how many people are in the United States, and assuming that that's, exactly what happens here, but there is 340 million people in the United States, and that does include children, elderly, right? So people on unemployment. So that number, assuming that's only the United States, would be close to 90% of all jobs being replaced by artificial intelligence. And to me, I could see that very well happening in the next 2 to 5 years. I would more so lean on the side of 50 to 90%. Obviously not maybe all of it occurs in the next 2 to 5 years, but this is something that I think everybody should be paying attention for, because in these next few years here, while it's a very hard time across the board and essentially everyone's getting priced out of everything, and really there's so many people in this country that are, and the world in general, that are just basically, surviving right now, basically getting distracted by everything that's happening in the news while all this is unfolding around you. And if you're not prepared for this, what's going to happen is 90% of people potentially will lose their jobs. What happens then? What happens when 90%, and I'm talking everybody, and this is not just, blue collar, this is white collar, this is desk jobs, this is hospitality, this is everything. And as much as we all may love the technology around us, our smartphones, our devices, the Tesla cars, self-driving, this and that will be what basically replaces the average person. If you've not been paying attention to what the humanoids essentially, which are the robot technology that can basically replace humans at the base scale. And then on top of that, we have large language models now, such as ChatGPT and et cetera, that can essentially replace anyone that's doing a desk job at the end of the day. So while that seems like a super scary world, and potentially what it could be coming very, very quick, and a lot quicker than many would be willing to admit, I think that it's just important to be aware of it and figure out a way to position yourself accordingly. Because what I believe, and this is taking it all back to what I think that Bitcoin and blockchain technology was created for, was exactly this. And again, nothing to me happens by happenstance in this world. I truly believe this has been something that's been in the making this entire time. We go back here to these overall 20 year cycles here, and just how crazy is it that every 20 years you get a massive black swan event, right? And then you get a massive top in all the markets. So again, Bitcoin blockchain gets created, reason being, if 300 million people lose their jobs and everyone is scrambling for income at that point, what happens? Well, we got a taste of it in 2020 when everybody got a $1,200 check, right? If you're not positioned properly, and if you rely only on your income at that point, if you don't have anything else in the making, if you don't have any other investments, any savings potentially, or any other hustles, right? So you will be more than likely introduced to what's known as universal basic income, which is basically the idea that every citizen receives a recurring payment from the government, regardless of employment status, to cover basic living needs. And if universal basic income is implemented, it will be utilized through central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, that run off of the blockchain. Distribution would be direct, automated, and programmable, and instead of mailing checks or depositing into bank accounts, the central bank could issue CBDCs straight to your digital wallets. So that's why I believe that Bitcoin was created. I think that also that will be the number one asset as we go forward, as it already pretty much is. I think that the powers that be have done a great job of tricking everybody, tricking the majority, and basically just making everyone look one way while they were doing the other, and basically pricing everyone out of that one asset that would have been essentially a once in a lifetime ever since gold was created or found. And if you look around us right now and all the integration that's being utilized with crypto and everything like that, it just makes the most sense, on top of everything that's going on with AI as well, right? So I'm interested to hear your comments down in the section. Let me know what you think of this. Again, this is just my opinion. I'm doing more and more research on this as the days go on. It's just something that has always had my attention as to why and what could cause a Great Depression, type style move in the coming years here. And as always, folks, there's great depressions, and then there's great opportunities that arise from them if you're positioned correctly. So at the end of the day, folks, the origins of Bitcoin may never be fully known, and maybe that's the point. Whether it was created by an individual, a collective, or even designed by the higher powers that be, What matters is the impact it has on money, trust, and freedom. Bitcoin gave us the first real chance to step outside the traditional financial system and ask questions we weren't asking before. And in a world where nothing of consequence happens by chance, that in itself is powerful. If you'd like to continue the conversation with us, join us over at datadashpro.com, is where I go dive deeper daily into the crypto and the broader markets as well. My name is Paul Sampson. This is DataDash. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. And until then, everybody, cheers.